Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Futures Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host on the Inequalities channel. I'm here today with Ben Phillips, and it's a special pleasure to be here with Ben Phillips, who's the author of a very important book that we'll speak about in a second, who's also an advisor to the UN, to governments, to NGOs. He's been working on topics of inequality for a long time. Will hopefully tell us a lot about it in a moment. I'm especially happy to have him here today because very often we speak about this very frustrating thing that is inequality, and that's growing and it's becoming worse, and all of us researching it become very depressed. And Ben is hopefully going to tell us what we can do about it. He's not only sure that we can win the fight against inequality, he also knows how we could do it. So we're very curious to hear something about this. Welcome, Ben.
Welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, we're, as I said, very happy to have you here. And we want to start right away with your book, which has the fantastic title of How to Fight Inequality and Why This Fight Needs You. And of course, we would like to have some preliminary answers to these questions. Of course, for the whole answer, you will read the book. You should definitely do it. But I want to start asking you about this quote that you start the book with, fantastic H.G. Wells quote that says, "I don't think this world was made for a small minority to dance on the faces of everyone else." And with that, I would like to ask you, is fighting inequality just a moral imperative, or why do you think it's necessary or it's a good thing to fight against inequality?
Sure. I think it is a moral imperative. I'm not neutral. There's a strange thing in parts of academia that we have to be neutral. I have what in the church tradition they call the bias to the poor. And I think that inequality is an injustice, and it hurts the dignity of the poor and the rich, and that it's unhealthy for us. There's brilliant work by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett on what inequality does to society. And they plot, for example, how unequal societies have higher murder rates, higher suicide rates, higher teen pregnancy rates, higher obesity rates, higher stress rates, lower trust rates. All of that says that the human person is broken by inequality, and a truly flourishing society in which we're all able to be the best that we can individually and with each other doesn't allow that level of inequality. So I think it's not just, to me, it's not just a fascinating topic. It's an outrage that I want to tackle. And so I wrote the book, How to Fight Inequality and Why That Fight Needs You, for people who want to be part of that fight.
So how do we fight inequality then?
So I started by looking at history.
Mm-hmm.
For me, that seemed to be the answer. But it started, first of all, with how not to fight inequality. And this is a kind of reflection of where I think I'd gone wrong. And I think a lot of people working on the issue had gone wrong. I'd been working a lot on trying to make the case for action against inequality, trying to prove it. And when I first started doing that around a decade or so ago, it was still very controversial. Just to say the following things: inequality is rising, inequality is harmful, and the state needs to act to tackle inequality. Those three things were deeply controversial. You now can't get through a World Bank report without seeing that in the intro. Now, what's been shocking is how, when we moved from those words being controversial, the stone that was thrown away, and they instead became the cornerstone, now every country has signed up to Sustainable Development Goals. Now there's been a 5 times increase in the number of books on inequality. It's the absolute mainstream. But what action has happened? You know, you can count on one hand and have fingers to spare the numbers of governments that are seriously addressing inequality, and yet 190 of them have signed up to do something about it. So I think where I'd gone wrong was in thinking that if you shift people from denial to acceptance, if you shift powerful people from denial to acceptance, then you've won. Of course you haven't. Because at root, it's not a debate. It's not a kind of common room discussion, polite discussion over port in a university hall. It's a struggle for assets and for power. And having found then that kind of being right, was not enough, that we were in a situation where, when all was said and done, more had been said than done, I wanted to look at, well, what does work? If it's not that, what does work? I went back and I found two big historical periods where inequality had been reduced. And I thought, well, why don't I organize the book and the ideas around those, around what had actually worked, what had brought them together? So what are those two? The first, which will be familiar for many of your viewers, is Latin America for about a decade or a decade and a half after the year 2000. That happens across Latin America. I think it's around 10 countries see a significant reduction. And it takes place for at least a decade, in some cases for 15 years. The other one, which is much broader, happens all across the world and goes on much longer, but is much older. It's from the 20th century. And that's what's known as the Golden Age. That period ends in around 1975 or thereabouts. Now, when does that period start? Some say that it starts at the end of the Second World War, and it did for some. For others, it started later. So for newly independent African and Asian countries, it came with independence. So for some, that was the 40s, the 50s, 60s, or later. But for some countries, it became much earlier than the 1940s. So in Scandinavia, it happens from the 1930s onwards. In England, it seems to happen from about 1870. So it seems to be that in England, we have a downward trajectory of inequality from around 1870 to 1970. That's pretty amazing, 100 years of progress. So that Golden Age period is the second. So I looked at those two periods, the Latin American period of the 21st century and the much more international period of the 20th century, of the long mid 20th century, as it's known. And I asked, from those two periods, what is it that seems to happen? Here's again something I found was not right. Sometimes people think perhaps it's the leaders. Perhaps there were truly fantastic leaders. Perhaps it was the individual personality of a Lula in Brazil, or in the US of a Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s, or in the UK of a Clement Attlee in the post-45 government. When I looked back at those contexts, what I found was that the main story is not who's on the stage. The main story is the organizing and challenge from below. That some of those leaders, like, for example, FDR or later Kennedy and Johnson in the US, who are now famous as having delivered transformative changes, they would never have done so had it not been for an organized push, had it not been for an organized push by groups together, trade unions, Black organizations, women's groups, community groups, pushing together. Without their action, these famous faces would not be so famous. So the story then becomes not so much about these famous figures, individual heroes, if you like, but about the everyday heroes, the ordinary people. And that's why the book is about what you can do, because it seems to be, and I say this not as an idealist, but as a historian, it seems to be, history says, the facts are, history is made by people. It's not made by impersonal economic and social forces. It is made by people, but it's not made by a handful of people. It's made by many people acting in concert together. So then the question became, so what did those groups of people do? And that's what I try to look at in the book.
You said in the very beginning that you wrote it for a specific group of people, let's say, or for people you had in mind. Who are those people you have in mind that you address in this, what you can do about inequality?
So I didn't write it for people in government. Some people think that I don't like people who work in government. That's not the case. My argument for why we can't rely on people in authority is not that they're bad. In fact, I think that an enormous amount of time is wasted by focusing on the personal morality of, is this leader good or is this leader bad? We need to change the incentives. At the moment, it's extraordinarily easy to serve the 1% and extraordinarily difficult to serve the 99%. I want to shift those ratios, make it extraordinarily hard to serve the 1% and extraordinarily easy to serve the 99%. So I didn't write it for people in power. Neither did I write it for that tiny minority of people who still remain, who will say, inequality is not really a problem. I need more research. I need more evidence. You haven't come up with enough. The fact that you found that there's 10 families in Africa that have the same wealth as the other half of the continent isn't enough. The fact that you found that under COVID, the billionaires have got richer whilst working people have put their lives on the line. That's not enough. There's never enough for those people. I'm not focused on those. They remind me of what were called the bitter enders in South Africa, the old Afrikaners who could never give up on apartheid. Or they remind me of that old Japanese soldier that was still in the Philippines jungle fighting World War II. I'm not bothered with those. My focus is on the vast majority of people who get the inequalities wrong, that it's gone too high, and that government needs to tackle it. So I'm trying to arm them non-violently. I'm trying to arm them with the tools to make a difference. Those are the people who have historically been the change, and therefore my work is addressed to them.
Let's talk about these arms then. What kind of arms do we need, and how do we employ them? And will people take them up once they have them?
Sure. So when I looked back at these two quite different periods, so the Latin America of the 2000s and then this long mid-20th century that took place in Europe, the US, and the newly independent countries in Africa and Asia, when I look back at those two periods, I found three common lessons. The first is the importance of overcoming deficits. That is to say, when you first start to address structural inequalities, people will say extraordinarily unpleasant things about you. And not just the government will say this, your family will say this. They'll say, why are you causing such a ruckus? Why are you disturbing the peace? I looked, for example, at how people now talk about Black Lives Matter. They'll say it's very difficult, very controversial, very polarizing. And they have this amazing phrase. They'll say, why can't they be more like Martin Luther King? So I went back and I thought, well, what did people say about Martin Luther King at the time? Well, in 1966, 2/3 of people said that Martin Luther King was a divisive figure who was harming progress. So what they say now about Black Lives Matter is exactly what they said then about Martin Luther King. So you have to be willing to stand up to be called a troublemaker. The Bolivian indigenous people who stood up for land rights, that's what they were called before they became the government. The Nandas workers of Brazil, that's what they were called. The suffragettes who fought only for the right of women to vote were called dangerous by the New York Times. Right? So whatever you start to do when you want to make society more decent, more equal, more fair, you'll always be called a troublemaker every single time. So if you're not being called that, statistically, the chances of you then being part of a social transformation are unfortunately zero. And if you are being called that, don't worry, because you're in the best company.
That gives me some hope.
So that's the first. The second is you need to build collective power. Very simply, working class people and middle class people, in other words, ordinary people, broadly defined, are never powerful on their own. We've been sold a myth that somehow if you work super hard, or if you study super well, or if you invent something brilliant, or if you come up with an app or some great innovation, you as an individual can transform things. Never happened, not true. Perhaps for the super rich who can buy politicians, buy elections, buy legislation, they can. But for the rest of us, for everybody else, we're only ever powerful together. You have to join forces with somebody. And when we look back at those historical periods of when inequality was reduced, it was always after organizations had strengthened. One in particular stands out, and that's trade unions. That where you have strong, what people call union density, which is basically what share of the population belongs to a trade union, you see inequality go down. So joining a union is not just about in your job having health and safety and better wages and dignity. It's about in your country having a stronger and more decent society. So trade unions are absolutely key. In the golden age in Europe and in America, when inequality is being reduced is when trade union membership is high. As trade union membership starts to fall, inequality goes through the roof. Another part of it is because trade unions are not enough, they're fundamental but not enough, is about how other forms of organizing are also needed, and then about how those forms of organizing together need to unify. So you need groups, and then you need groups of groups. So those constituencies could include the trade union movement, could also include people's organizations, social movements, faith-based organizations who often play a very important role, who often, that role is often not looked at significantly enough by secular-minded progressive folks, but absolutely key. When those groups come together in what the Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign in the US cause fusion coalitions. That's when you have real strength. The third lesson is that individual policies, no one individual policy is enough to tackle inequality. It's never been done with one policy. It's a series of them. And every single one in those series is controversial and difficult. You need to bind them together with a story, with a narrative. You need to enter the world of myth, of telling a story, of painting a picture. This is something that some progressives are quite unhappy to do. They say we're technical people, we're scientists, we just do facts. Well, if you just do facts and all the facts are on your side and all the good stories, all the imagery are on their side, you lose. I don't want to lose. I want to win. There's a reason why the most famous and most impactful neoliberal is not their greatest intellectual, Milton Friedman. It's their greatest performer, Ronald Reagan, a movie star who goes on to be president, who transforms first his country and then the world in the wrong image. But let's not just be angry with them. Let's learn from what they did. So we too need to build stories in the same way that we did actually in the past. The trade union movement, for example, was all about songs, was all about placards and posters and banners. We need to have a vision of the society that we want to build.
I think this sounds all very fantastic, and I'd be in on singing together for equality. The question that I have there is towards this fusion coalition that you mentioned, which basically goes back to this question of power relations, right?
Yes.
I mean, how do we create these coalitions when, as you say, this is a power struggle in the end?
Yes. And what's so clever about sophisticated modern forms of inequality is how complex they are. In the first wave of colonialism in Africa, you had a situation where at times all Africans were treated, or all non-whites were treated equally appallingly. Now, the colonialists realized that such a scenario was bound to fall. And therefore, what they did was they started to pick. They started to pick and choose. So they would give a slightly less, still oppressive, but slightly less horrific situation to Indian minorities or to mixed race people, what became the coloreds in South Africa, for example. Or in the French and Belgian colonies, they gave out civilization certificates to a small number of Africans who they decided were sufficiently French or Belgian to be worthy of acceptance. The purpose of those, or we also saw particular ethnic groups or tribes harnessed to work alongside the colonial government. This is a classic divide and rule tactic. And we see this again played out in all sorts of scenarios. Cesar Chavez, who was organizing in the US, he was organizing farm workers. Cesar Chavez's core constituency were Mexican Americans and others from Central and South America. They were united by language and by faith. But he realized that if they were to succeed, they would have to go work with the Filipino Americans who shared a faith, but were divided in terms of language, did not speak Spanish. And there was a big divide between the Filipino Americans and the Mexican Americans. And that divide, until Cesar Chavez was able to work through that, to build an alliance that was big enough, first with them, and then later on also managed to bring along poor white Protestants, divided not only through the language, but also from faith. Only when he was able to form that wider group were they strong enough to beat the companies. And what elites will do if they see people start to mobilize is they will try and pick people off. They will try and play their prejudices. Elites never say, vote for me, because if you vote for me, I'll make you poorer and my mates richer. They never say that because it'd be a disaster. They never run on cold neoliberalism. They say, vote for me because my opponent wants to let Muslims marry your daughter or wants to teach controversial sex education. They'll pick on our prejudices. They'll never say what honestly is behind their project. And so what's really key for people who are organizing is to find ways to break down those barriers. It seems to be that you can't break down those barriers with an argument. There's not a sentence that wins it. And one of the ways that progressives have gone a bit wrong in recent times is that because they're not enough in the weave of everyday life, they're not enough in the everyday work of helping people get better wages, helping people get better local health centers, helping them protect their parks, secure public transport, change their everyday life. They don't have the relationships of trust to challenge it when fascists and xenophobes come along and try and blame ethnic minorities, indigenous people, immigrants, difficult feminists, or whoever it is that they seek to blame. If we are to be in such a position that we can challenge that prejudice, say, don't listen to these people, it's nonsense, then we need to have those relationships of trust. We need to be organizing at the factory floor, organizing at the village, organizing through the churches, organizing through the women's groups, the community groups. That's where we need to be. So the trick with a fusion coalition is a recognition, first of all, that divided you lose. There's this beautiful saying in Spanish, the people united will never be defeated, right? I love it. It's not true, sadly. The people united are often defeated, but what is true is this: the people divided are always defeated. So that's the first thing. You need unity. The second thing is about how to build unity. And unity seems to come not through an argument, but through practice. Practice accompaniment, practice being at someone's side, practice helping them change their life, and then work with them. When people start to organize, you're not organizing perfect people. You're not organizing people without prejudice, but through organizing, through the work of struggle, people's minds change. You don't first seek to change their mind before you're willing to organize them.
So about this organization, which I think is a brilliant idea. I mean, the practical approach to deal with inequalities, right? And knowing that people do have prejudice, how do you go about, I don't know, is it a question of tolerance to practice nonetheless with people that you don't agree with? Or do you try to find a common ground? Or what would be an approach to bridge these prejudice gaps?
Well, it seems to be that what has worked historically is this double combination. One, you find a common ground. You find something that both groups care about. So, for example, Green New Deal. It's brilliant in bringing together the young environmental activists who are passionate about not destroying their inheritance of a planet that's livable, and workers who have been very worried about some kind of 1.0 versions of environmentalism that seem to suggest that their jobs would disappear. The Green New Deal says, no, you'll get better jobs. This is about a greater prosperity. This is where we have clean public transport, a new industrial revolution. This is about better work. So we need to find those common causes. I think there's a great series of campaigns around minimum wages, which is another great common cause, or around how do you get parents to be able to have leave after their kids are born. These are things that are hugely popular, poll extraordinarily well, including with people who would call themselves social conservatives. So it seems to be that what works is, first, you find that common cause. And secondly, you help people build together. That it's through their interaction that may start based on this immediate objective that people learn to trust each other. If you just bring people together with no context, that doesn't work. It's too romantic, too dreamy. Bring people together imperfectly, knowing that it's difficult for some common cause which people identify with and see as personal. And then when you stop people being strangers from each other, they start to know each other by names, then that's when you can start to challenge some of this. And when people start to see who is it that's really got my back and who is it that doesn't, and they start to see that the elites who seek to feed our prejudices instead of our stomachs, in the end are doing it for themselves. They're offering nothing real.
I think that's really great insights, and I'm wondering, on a practical side, what surprised you when you found this? I mean, I find this a very innovative approach, because most people, when they study inequality, they study the parts, history or historical parts where inequality rose, right? And then we try to explain what happened there and why things became worse. And the fact that you turn this around and you look at when did it actually work? I mean, that's really a brilliant approach. What did you find there? I mean, what is different when you take this approach? What surprised you when you looked at this?
So I think the thing that surprised me was how common were these lessons. There's very much an emphasis today, and rightly so in many ways, about how every situation is different, how every context is particular. And that has many strengths because it goes against broad brush. There can be a tyranny of the broad brush and a cultural hegemony of the broad brush too. But what I found as I pieced these pieces together was how much people had in common in terms of all these approaches. So I could be studying Sweden and Norway in the 1930s, or I could be talking with small farmers in El Salvador today and finding an extraordinary amount of common experience in terms of what seemed to work when people wanted to push back inequality. So I was really quite delighted by how much commonality there was. I think that what's been lost in parts today is around the work of practical organizing. I think that there's a problem in progressive movements that we've become overly professionalized. And so often people lack an experience, for example, of workplace organizing, of being a union member, of making things better in their place by building collective power. I think that's been lost. I think in academia, there's been a bit of a loss as well in that practical side of the how, that often people imagine what their role is to simply announce analysis and facts to decision makers, and then something will happen. I was in a gathering where I was the only civil society person. It was full of some great economists using Greek letters that I didn't understand. And I just put my hand up at one moment and I said, "Hi, so I'm just trying to understand. It seems to me that what we're doing here is we're trying to analyze why inequality is wrong, and we're trying to put forward the policies that would tackle inequality. And we're doing that so that then decision makers act and reduce inequality. Is that our project?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Okay. So let's take any continent from any time period in the last 150 years. Can somebody give me an example where intellectuals doing that analysis of the problem and solution and offering it to governments in a report, where that has been the cause of a transformational shift in a reduction of inequality?" One country from any time period, anywhere. They went silent. And then everybody started laughing. So at some level, people know that there's a problem with that.
Or crying.
With that approach. Yeah, sure. But I don't think there is a tradition. So this is not completely new. I don't think anything I say in the book is new. I would say it's much more about rediscovery. I wanted to rediscover what are the lessons that have worked. One of the most misremembered movements is the civil rights movements in the States. And so, for example, people now think, or this is how it's been deliberately manipulated in memory. They think it was never controversial. And so they take from that the lesson that you must never be a troublemaker. When absolutely, the civil rights movement was all about causing what former Congressman John Lewis called good trouble. Secondly, they think it's about individuals. They think it's about Rosa Parks sat down, Martin Luther King gave a speech. Not about that. It's about organizing. The civil rights movement only succeeded because it was organized. They think it's only about one vertical of inequality, that it was only about preventing the most egregious formal blocks on Black people being able to participate. No. Martin Luther King said, it's meaningless if now a Black man is no longer banned from going to the burger bar but cannot afford a burger. It was about a structural economic critique. And then lastly, they imagine, or now we're told, that it was about 2 or 3 pieces of legislation, the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act. No, it was about decades, a series of building a different story. So just rediscovering the true story of what the Civil Rights Campaign was about gives so much potential for organizers today. It's a hidden gem, and it's intentionally hidden because there's so much power behind it.
Ben, before we come to a close in this fantastic conversation, I'd like to ask you what made you interested in the subject in the first place. I mean, why did you decide to become a campaigner, advertiser, intellectual, professional, academic, etc., author against inequality?
I grew up in great privilege. And when I say I went to a right wing school, this gives you an insight as to how right wing it was. I was in the minority that thought that the defeat of apartheid was a good thing. So I would argue with the other kids at my school. And one of them said to me, he said, but the thing is, you'll never have to live it. You'll never have to be there. So you can wish for this damaging, destructive act on South Africa, but you'll never be there. So I said, well, I'm going to go. I'm going to go. I'm going to go. I'm going to live in a township. I'm going to teach. I was 17 when I was saying this stuff. But young people are great because they commit to crazy things and then they go do them. So in 1994, Mandela became president in June 1994. In September 1994, I arrived in Mamelodi, which is the main township of Pretoria. And when I got there, I found I was the only white person. I should have realized that that would be the case, but I had no idea. And people extraordinarily kindly took me under their wing, took me to everything, told me about the struggle that they had fought against apartheid, about how they'd banded together and won, about how school kids, how churches, trade unions, workers' groups, civil society groups had stood up to a seemingly impregnable force and been victorious. And one day they took me to see Mandela speak, and we were in this stadium, and Mandela's at the mic, and he's amazing. He's amazing. And I looked at him, and I am in the presence of a hero. And then I looked around at everybody else, and I said, no, I'm in the presence of 30,000 heroes. And I later on read something by Desmond Tutu where he said this about Nelson Mandela. He said, he's just a pebble on the beach, a beautiful pebble, but just a pebble nonetheless. And what he meant, and he meant this with great love for his great friend, but what he was trying to say was that the most extraordinary transformation is the transformation that people achieve together. And so ever since then, I've held in me this kind of kernel of truth, but I got lost. I worked in different NGOs. I was director of campaigns for Oxfam, director of campaigns for ActionAid. And you can get lost in NGO bureaucracy, and you can start to feel that maybe it's your NGO that's bringing the change. But we know that never is the truth, that it's never a vanguard that delivers change. It's always the people together. And as I started to work on inequality, I started to realize that those lessons that I'd forgotten were perhaps the most important, that change isn't made by the professionals, it's made by the amateurs. And that got me back onto this cause, which was to say, I don't just want to be a policy advisor or thinking that if I make noise in the newspapers one day and then put my suit on, go see a politician the next day, I'm bringing about change. I was conning myself. And I realized that I needed to tell the story of real change. I wanted this book to exist and no one was writing it. And people said when I started writing it, they're like, why another book on inequality? Well, because no one's written this one. No one's written a book about how to do it and about how ordinary people are the people that would do it. And that's what the book aims to do.
We're certainly all, well, I mean, I am, and I hope that everybody else that reads it soon will also be very grateful that you did write it. I think it's a very important conversation to have. The missing step, if we want to come from less ego to more solidarity, which is how I interpret your pebble metaphor, or to Desmond's metaphor. Ben, thank you so much for sharing these stories with us and help us build a story to unite and to fight against inequality, to make good trouble, all of us. Thank you for being here with us. And thank you all for watching another episode of Futures Frame TV. We hope you like this conversation. And if you want to learn more about inequalities or join the conversation, please come again next Saturday for another episode of Futures Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host on the Inequalities channel for Traces.Dreams. And I hope you'll go out and make some good trouble soon. And we get rid of inequality, or at least improve the situation. Have a good day. See you soon. Bye-bye.